Hi guys, my name is Matti Sulanto. Welcome to another video, this time from Melbourne, Australia. In this video I'm gonna share some of my current favorite street settings, camera settings. And I'm saying current because, at least in my case, I don't know about you, but in my case the favorite settings tend to change over time, more or less, and it also depends on the camera I'm currently using. However, these settings, they work with every camera, whether it's the Ricoh GR3 or 3X or Sony a6700 or any camera with the PA, S and M shooting modes. All the pictures in this video were shot on this Sony a6700 camera and the Viltrox 20mm f2.8 full frame lens. It's a really nice street combo, by the way. The 20mm focal length equals nicely almost to the classic 28mm lens, which is one of the most used lenses for street photography. And these pictures are from Kuala Lumpur, not from Melbourne, because I just arrived a couple of days ago and haven't had time to shoot really much yet. First, the autofocus settings. I'm an autofocus guy these days. I almost never use manual focus for street or travel photography because autofocus simply is so much more convenient. The Ricoh GR3 and 3X both have some excellent manual focus modes that I have covered in this video up here, and many people use those very successfully in street photography. However, I'm an autofocus guy even with the GR and GR3X. The autofocus settings and also the performance varies a lot from camera to camera. However, this is what I do. I almost always use single autofocus point. If the camera's autofocus tracking performance is really solid and reliable, like it is on, for example, on the Sony a6700, I use continuous autofocus and subject tracking. It works really well on this camera. However, for example, on the Ricoh, it doesn't work that well because the autofocus is not that quick. On this camera, I use single autofocus point, and I just touch on the screen and put the autofocus point on my main subjects and fire away. And that works really well for me. If I'm shooting something that doesn't require any specific aperture or shutter speed and there are no major moving elements in the picture, let's call them streetscapes, for example, pictures like this. I set my camera on P mode and auto ISO, and I set the minimum auto ISO speed fairly low, like 1/30th of a second, so the camera stays at the lowest ISO setting even if the light levels drop slightly. With the front dial I can control the program shift. That allows me to change the aperture and shutter speed value if necessary, and with the exposure compensation dial I can control the overall exposure. My experience is that pretty much every camera chooses quite sensible values, aperture and shutter speed in almost every situation, and I almost never have to touch the program shift. And I almost never have to touch the exposure compensation either. I think, at least my cameras, they expose really nicely and evenly. And because I shoot RAW, I guess I have become slightly lazy too. It's so easy to correct minor exposure errors in post, and to be honest, the so-called correct exposure is somewhat also a matter of opinion too, or a matter of taste. If I'm shooting portraits in bright light, I put my camera on aperture priority and auto ISO, and my aperture varies between wide open and f2.8 depending on the lens I have and depending on the camera I have. The reason I'm using aperture priority in bright light is that I can control my aperture, and in bright light I don't have to worry about any kind of motion blur. Whenever you are shooting portraits or taking pictures of people, you'll want to keep your shutter speed short enough to avoid motion blur on your main subject, the person in the picture. My experience is that something like 1/100 or faster is usually fast enough to avoid that motion blur. However, if I'm shooting portraits in a low light, I put my camera on shutter priority mode and auto ISO, of course. Then I set my shutter speed to 1/100 or slightly faster to avoid that motion blur. And the camera can decide on the aperture. Usually it's wide open if it's low light situation. Sometimes the ISO value can creep up a little bit in low light if you have a fast-ish shutter speed like 1/100 or a little bit faster. However, I think modern cameras are so good in low light, it doesn't really matter, and motion blur instead can potentially ruin a great portrait. Then if I shoot some action photos, action street photos, I guess most traditional street photos fall into this category. I set my camera exposure mode to M, manual exposure and auto ISO. Then I select my shutter speed between 1/250, 1/500, depending on the situation. If you want to make sure that you completely freeze all action like walking people on the street, you'll select 1/500 or maybe even slightly faster than that. And then I set my aperture between f5.6 and f11 depending on the camera or the lens that I have. On a full frame camera I use higher aperture values, and on a micro four thirds camera I can use lower aperture values to get the same amount of depth of field. The whole point with the manual exposure mode here is to have a full control over the aperture and the shutter speed and let the auto ISO take care of the final exposure. And also in this case I can affect the final exposure with the exposure compensation if necessary. But like I said earlier in this video, I'm a little bit lazy and I shoot RAW. I almost never have to touch the exposure compensation because it's so easy to fine-tune the exposure in post. What about the custom memory modes then? Why don't I use those? Well, I have never really learned to use them or learn to appreciate them. But by all means, if you like to use the custom memory modes that are available on pretty much every camera these days, save these settings on your camera's custom memory if that helps you to shoot better or shoot faster. In street photography and also sometimes in travel photography, the photo moment can appear very unexpectedly and suddenly. That's why it's important to be ready, and it's important to experiment with different settings and shooting styles so you can find the settings and the style that works for you so that you can be ready to capture that unexpected photo moment. I hope the settings that I shared in this video can help you to be ready when that next photo moment appears. If you found this video helpful or useful, please do consider buying me a cup of coffee. There's a link down below for that if you don't live in Finland. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you soon in the next one.